It's been nearly 6 years since that unforgettable camping trip in West Virginia, back when I was still in high school. Yet, the memory remains vivid, the kind that makes your skin crawl no matter how warm the day is. There were 6 of us: Jake, Travis, Cooper, Matt, Derek, and me. At 17, we felt invincible in the way only teenagers do, completely oblivious to the fact that we were utterly unprepared for what awaited us in those woods. The night before, we had all crashed at Jake's place, sprawled out across his basement floor in sleeping bags, listening to the relentless downpour hammering against the windows. The storm raged through the night, only letting up around 8 a.m., leaving behind an eerie, almost unnatural stillness. The plan was simple: head to a familiar camping spot in the woods near Jake's house, a place we had visited more times than we could count. But this time felt different. By early afternoon, we had packed up 2 four-wheelers, loading them with our gear, a wagon carrying our tents, coolers, and an unnecessary amount of junk food. Yet, from the moment we set out, the atmosphere felt off. You know that heavy, charged feeling in the air right before a thunderstorm. That tingling sensation that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. It was like that, only worse. The sky was a suffocating, unbroken expanse of grey, pressing down on us. The air was thick and stifling, carrying an odd metallic scent, something like ozone mixed with wet copper. The trail we always took was about 3 miles long, weaving through dense forest and cutting across a couple of shallow creeks. We had traveled it dozens of times before, but that day everything seemed wrong. The usual sounds of the woods, birds chirping, squirrels rustling through the leaves, were absent. Silence swallowed everything except for the steady growl of our four-wheelers and the sucking sound of tires slogging through the mud. About halfway in, we stopped for a quick break. Travis lit a cigarette and we passed around some sodas, trying to shake the unsettling vibe that clung to us. And then, it happened. The first sign that something was seriously off. Roughly 40 yards ahead, something dark and impossibly fast shot across the trail. We all saw it, but no one wanted to be the first to admit that it wasn't just a deer. The way it moved, smooth, deliberate, was nothing like the startled, erratic dash of an animal. It had intent. What should have been an hour-long ride stretched into nearly 3. Fallen trees blocked our usual paths, forcing us to navigate frustrating detours. The creeks, swollen from the storm, were dangerous to cross, slowing us down even more. By the time we finally arrived at our campsite, the weak afternoon sun was already slipping behind the trees, casting long, creeping shadows across the ground. It was only around 4:00 p.m., but it felt much later, like the darkness was coming too soon, eager to swallow the daylight. We set up camp quickly, though none of us wanted to admit how unsettled we still felt. The tents went up, and we scattered to gather firewood, trying to shake the creeping unease. That's when Cooper stopped dead in his tracks, staring toward a dense patch of trees about 50 yards away. At first, we thought he was messing with us. But then we saw it, a massive figure eerily resembling a deer. But standing upright, it was absurd. Deer don't walk on 2 legs. We let out uneasy laughs, forcing ourselves to believe it was just some weird trick of the light, a product of our frayed nerves. But then it moved, and what we saw next defied all logic. The thing had to be at least 10 feet tall, its elongated limbs propelling it through the forest with an eerie, human-like grace. It didn't bolt like a frightened animal. It maneuvered with an unsettling, calculated speed, not clumsy like a bear trying to balance on 2 legs. This was different, too smooth, too controlled. In the fading light, its shadowy form melted into the trees, leaving us paralyzed in stunned silence. That night, we stayed huddled close to the fire, jumping at every distant crack of a twig, every whisper of movement in the leaves. We tried to rationalize it, a bear, maybe, a trick of the shadows, our imaginations getting the best of us. But deep down, we knew better. We never saw it again during the trip, but the feeling of being watched never left. Sleep was nearly impossible. We took turns keeping the fire alive, waiting anxiously for the first light of dawn. We packed up faster than we ever had before, breaking camp in record time. The strange heaviness in the air had lifted, but the unease clung to us. The ride back was silent, tense. At some point, we made a pact, not to tell anyone what we'd seen. Who would believe 6 teenagers anyway? Years later, whenever we get together, someone inevitably brings up that night. The conversation always fades into a quiet lull, and we all remember that thing in the woods, towering among the trees, moving in a way nothing natural should. I haven't camped in those woods since. Some things change you forever, and some questions are better left unanswered. Still, looking back, there are details from that night I've tried to forget. Things that didn't make sense then, and make even less sense now. During the night, while taking turns keeping watch, we heard noises. Not the usual forest sounds, these were different. Around 2 a.m., during my shift with Jake, we heard something. It sounded like wood snapping, but not the random breaking of a branch underfoot. This was deliberate, precise, as if something was methodically breaking trees apart. Worse, the sounds came from different directions, like whatever was out there was circling us. During Matt's watch, he saw eyes reflecting the flashlight's beam, but they weren't at ground level, where you'd expect from a deer or a coyote. They were high up, at least 8 feet above the ground. Derek, always the skeptic, always the one to find a logical explanation for everything, went silent after his shift. To this day, he refuses to talk about what he saw, what he heard. But it was what we found the next morning that truly cemented our fear. As we scrambled to pack, desperate to leave, Travis discovered something just beyond our campsite, something that made my blood run cold. Roughly 30 yards away, there was a perfect circle of dead vegetation, about 15 feet across. Every plant inside it was shriveled, blackened, like something had drained the life out of them. Overnight, the ground felt different, unnaturally hard, almost like it had been crystallized. When Cooper snapped a picture of it with his old flip phone, it looked fine at first. But later, when he tried to show us, the image was nothing but a distorted blur. The strangest part, right in the center of that dead patch was a single, massive footprint, if you could even call it that. Nearly 2 feet long, it didn't match anything we'd ever seen. Too narrow for a bear, too wide for a deer, and most disturbingly, it had 6 distinct toe impressions. The edges were eerily sharp, as if the print had been pressed into soft clay. But the ground beneath it was rock solid. Things only got weirder when we returned to Jake's house. Every single compass we'd brought was useless, their needles spinning or pointing in random directions. Our flashlights, brand new batteries before the trip, were completely drained. Then there was Travis's watch. It had stopped at exactly 3:33 a.m., even though he swore he checked the time at 4:00 during his shift, and it was working fine. We tried looking into similar incidents, digging through old records at the local library. The best we could find were newspaper clippings from the 1950s, mentioning a wave of unexplained livestock disappearances in those very woods. There were also scattered reports of strange lights, bizarre weather patterns, but nothing concrete, nothing that could explain what we had encountered. And then, the final twist. About a week later, all 6 of us noticed the same strange marking on our left wrists. 3 small dots, arranged in a perfect triangle. Like tiny bruises, they faded within days, but none of us ever spoke about them outside our group. Not long after, Jake's family moved away. Their property was sold to developers, and the last we heard, there were plans to clear the forest for new housing. But something happened. Construction equipment kept breaking down. Workers refused to stay after dark. Eventually, the entire project was abandoned. The official reason, environmental concerns. But I've always wondered, did they see something out there too? I work as a forest ranger in Colorado now, about as far from those West Virginia woods as I could get. But sometimes on quiet nights while I'm out on patrol, something unsettles me. A faint metallic scent in the air, The sharp, deliberate snap of wood breaking in the distance. In those moments, I know with absolute certainty that whatever we encountered that night wasn't confined to those woods. And last month, something happened that forced me to confront everything I had tried to forget. A letter arrived from Cooper, the first time any of us had communicated through actual mail in years. Inside was a small USB drive and a handwritten note. "I've been doing research. We weren't the only ones. Call me." Curious and uneasy, I plugged in the USB. What I found inside sent a chill down my spine. Hundreds of files, newspaper clippings, forum posts, personal accounts, all spanning decades, all connected to those West Virginia woods. Cooper had become obsessed with finding answers, and what he uncovered was deeply disturbing. The pattern was always the same. The metallic smell, electrical disturbances, sightings of impossibly tall figures moving between the trees. But it didn't stop there. Then 1887, an entire logging camp, 20 men, vanished without a trace. Their tools and supplies were left behind, the only clue, a single journal entry describing watchers in the canopy. The 1932, 3 geological surveyors reported discovering an uncharted cave system with walls that seemed to pulse with their own light. They disappeared 3 days later. The 1978, a group of college students conducting an environmental study documented perfectly circular patches of dead vegetation, just like we had. They also reported strange marks appearing on their wrists, which faded after a few days. The 1994, a wildlife researcher had set up motion, triggered cameras throughout the area. Most of the images showed nothing out of the ordinary: deer, bears, the occasional fox. But one photo, one single frame, made my hands shake. At first, I didn't even notice it, but there it was, standing in the background, partially obscured by the trees. A figure, and it was exactly what we had seen that night. Its proportions were all wrong. Its elongated head, if you could even call it that, seemed to be twisted completely backward. Shortly after submitting these photos to his university, the researcher vanished. The official report claimed he was the victim of a bear attack, but no body was ever recovered. Cooper kept digging, and what he uncovered next made everything even worse. He tracked down Jake's family. They hadn't just moved away on a whim, they had fled. Jake's father finally admitted the truth. After our camping trip, strange things began happening around their home. Objects moved on their own. Jake's little sister started talking about the tall people who watched her through her second-story window at night. Then, one morning, they found the same 3-dot triangle marks on her wrist. That was the last straw. They packed up and left for good. After reviewing all of this, I called Cooper. He told me he had taken his research a step further. Using facial recognition software, he tracked down old photos of people who had reported encounters in those woods over the past 30 years. The results were unsettling. In every post-incident photo, something had changed. Not just in their eyes, but in their entire expression, their presence. It was subtle, but undeniable. A shadow lingering over them. Then Cooper showed me a side-by-side comparison of my own face. My driver's license photo from after that night compared to one from before. And I saw it. Something was different. Like a part of me never really left those woods. Like I was carrying something with me. Then last week, Derek finally broke his silence. He called me in the middle of the night. His voice was shaking. He had seen it again. Not in West Virginia. This time in Minnesota, where he lives now. Derek had been driving home late from work when that familiar metallic scent filled his car. Then, glancing in his rearview mirror, he saw it. Something impossibly tall, standing by the roadside, its elongated head twisted unnaturally toward him. He didn't hesitate. He drove straight to the airport and took the first flight to his sister's house in Florida. If you ask Travis, he thinks they're studying us. Matt believes they're preparing for something bigger. But Cooper's research suggests something even worse. That they've been here far longer than we have, using the woods as some kind of gateway or an observation point. And then there's Jake. He hasn't responded to any of our messages in months. His social media went dark after posting a single, unsettling photo of his backyard in Seattle. In the background, barely noticeable at first, was a familiar sight. A perfect circle of dead vegetation. And then there's me. I don't know what to believe anymore, but I do know this. Those woods in West Virginia aren't just haunted by what we saw that night. They're haunted by what saw us. And sometimes, when I'm alone in my ranger station late at night, I catch movement in my peripheral vision. Something tall, something watching. That's why I'm writing this now, because yesterday I found a circle of dead vegetation outside my station, and in the center of it was a single, massive footprint, 6 toes. Above it, carved deep into a tree trunk, was a perfect triangle of 3 dots. I've been thinking about those woods, trying to remember everything before the strange events overtook the details. The forest there was different. Unlike any I've encountered in all my years as a ranger, the trees were ancient, towering hardwoods. Massive oaks and hickories, their trunks wider than car tires. The canopy was so dense that even on the brightest days, the forest floor remained in a state of perpetual twilight, even at midday. The ground was always damp, blanketed in a thick layer of decomposing leaves that silenced our footsteps. Moss coated everything, not just the north sides of trees, but entire fallen logs and boulders, stretching in thick, velvety carpets across the landscape. The air carried a deep, earthy scent, a mix of damp bark, mushrooms, and the sweet decay of old leaves. There were strange rock formations, too. Natural ridges that seemed to carve rough corridors through the woods. The locals called them wild backs, long, curved spines of weathered sandstone that jutted up from the forest floor like the skeletons of ancient giants. Water seeped from their bases, forming small springs that trickled down to feed the creeks. And then there were the rhododendrons, not the neat little bushes you'd find in a garden. These were monstrous, gnarled things, their twisted trunks and branches forming tunnels you could almost walk through. Their waxy leaves reflected what little light managed to filter through the dense canopy, bending shadows in ways that played tricks on your eyes. But what unsettles me the most, even now, was how the forest seemed to swallow sound, not just muffle it, but consume it entirely. You could yell, and your voice would carry only half as far as it should have. Even the birds, when they did call, sounded distant, muted, as if they weren't in the trees above us at all, but somewhere much farther away. It was as though the woods themselves were hungry for noise. One tree, in particular, stood out near our campsite, a massive white oak, but unlike any I'd ever seen. Its trunk had grown in a twisted spiral, like a thick rope winding upward toward the sky. The deep furrows in its bark cast shifting shadows, even when there was no wind. None of us wanted to camp too close to it. No one said why. Maybe we didn't know any better. Maybe deep down we did. We were just a bunch of reckless 17-year-olds back then. That forest was the only one we really knew. But the forest changed when night fell. During the day, you could at least pretend it was just an ordinary stretch of woods. But once darkness set in, it became something else. Something ancient, something aware. The spaces between the trees solidified into impenetrable walls of black, and the branches overhead twisted into jagged, alien shapes against the sky. The night carried a weight pressing in around us, pushing back against our flashlight beams like something alive. Even now, if I close my eyes, I can feel that forest. The way the damp earth gave slightly beneath each step, the cool moisture clinging to my skin, the strange, almost thick resistance in the air when I moved too fast. Like the place itself was pushing back, that forest wasn't just a place. It was something that had grown, evolved, and existed in isolation, untouched, unchanged. And sometimes, I wonder, was that thing we saw really separate from the woods at all? Or was it just the forest itself, shifting in ways we couldn't understand, reaching out, touching the intruders in its midst? That's the kind of thought that keeps you awake at night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind move through the trees outside your window and hoping, desperately, that it's just the wind.